Well, it started, and now we have a lot to talk about and catch up on, and a lot to watch. Let's back up to yesterday. Yesterday, I posted a YouTube short basically covering the denial of service attack that was hitting Ukrainian government and private institution. Of course, in the moment, given that there hadn't been any reports of any kind of data loss or malware detonation, it didn't appear to be that big of a deal, especially considering there had been denial of service attacks in the past. The primary concern, of course, came around the wider context around Ukraine and how Russian military forces were at a quote 100% readiness level. Contrast that with the denial of service attack last week, and it's definitely slightly more concerning. Well, not long after I posted that YouTube short, reports started coming out that unfortunately malware started detonating, and it was what we were concerned about. I had mentioned in some of my other videos, especially the one with the website defacement and the denial of service attacks, that it isn't until we start seeing things getting destroyed and malware getting detonated that we really have anything to be concerned about. But yesterday we had already seen a denial of service attack, and now we were getting reports that another wiper malware strain similar to WhisperGate back in January had been seen in Ukrainian systems. And if you aren't familiar with WhisperGate, we have a video on that already, and you can check that out in my Ukrainian playlist. I'll link that at the end of this video. However, basically it would overwrite the entire file system, but most critically, the master boot record, effectively disabling any computer systems that it detonated on. Well, we were seeing this new strain, and it was absolutely concerning, especially since it was in conjunction with a denial of service attack. If you remember back in January, there was a website defacement that, again, objectively wasn't that big of a deal. However, it was later reported to have been a distraction or a diversion from WhisperGate. In this case, we were seeing a denial of service attack that may have been a diversion from this new malware strain getting detonated. We're going to talk a lot more about this strain here in just a moment. Now, this combined with the fact that the Russian military had completely unspooled 80% of its combat power, was primed for an attack, combined as well with the increasing and escalatory rhetoric from Russia and the disinformation attempting to create a false pretext, it was certainly concerning that something was about to happen. I posted that video yesterday afternoon, and it really did not take much time for that video to again be outdated with more denial of service attacks and yet more website defacements being reported all throughout Ukraine. Of course, all of that came to a head whenever that evening, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, announced an effective declaration of war against Ukraine and military operations began. And that leads us to the elephant in the room, and that is what is currently going on between Russia and Ukraine. We're going to talk a lot about the cybersecurity element of this entire conflict, because I really believe that it is a driving factor in the escalation of this conflict outside of just Ukraine. But first, let's take a bit of a step back. For those of you that haven't quite been paying a lot of attention to what's going on and don't really know the background, let's go through a quick history lesson on the events leading up to this moment. As far back as last April, and remember this month, April of last year, because that is going to come up, believe it or not, with that malware strain. But in April of last month, we saw a semi-large buildup of Russian combat equipment on the border of Ukraine. Now, at the moment, it was only the combat equipment. They weren't also forward moving the sustainment assets or anything like that. It was just the combat elements. And after a little bit of time, they dropped the gear and moved the soldiers back. Now, notably, they dropped the gear, and that's because as soon as they moved the soldiers back, they came back with a lot of friends. And that started somewhere around November of last year. And that buildup continued until they reached this peak yesterday of somewhere close to 200,000 Russian soldiers. But most notably, that not only included 75% of the entire Russian military's combat power, that also included critical logistics and sustainment assets needed for a deep push into Ukraine. All of this was being tracked online. People were posting TikToks and on blogs. It was all being reported on sites like Twitter by the OSINT community. And so needless to say, the folks that were paying close attention to this were not shocked that hostilities ensued. If anything, they were shocked that it took this long, as the information warfare dynamic between the US and Russia appears to have actually had an impact on when the launch date actually occurred. Now, for those of you that might be wondering, why didn't the US or NATO do anything to better defend Ukraine if we knew about this whole situation going on this entire time? And that kind of leads us to a very difficult position that NATO has been in throughout the course of this buildup. Of course, throughout the buildup, Russia has been escalating its rhetoric, looking for a pretext to initiate hostilities against Ukraine. And it's all kind of built around the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. So that hamstrung the weapon systems and abilities that NATO had to be able to supply the Ukrainian army, and really only tactical level equipment such as Javelin and anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-air missiles, those were really the only kinds of assets that NATO was able to import, as well as non-lethal aid. Pair that with 7 years of having NATO advisors on the ground with the Ukrainian military, in agreement with NATO and Ukraine to be able to put cybersecurity advisors in Ukraine to help harden the government's infrastructure. And you have some degree of preparation, so it's not like nothing was being done, but certainly there was a threshold that had to be maintained to not further antagonize Russia. Despite all of that, Russia continued to build up its military on the border, escalate the rhetoric, and build out its false pretext for an invasion. That false pretext included claims that Ukraine was launching a genocide in Donbass in conjunction with a military offensive in Donbass. This also included a series of cyber attacks, which we've reported on this channel, on the Ukrainian government. On February 21st, Russia took the very escalatory step of recognizing the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries and pledged to support them militarily against their presumed Ukrainian occupier. And well, that takes us to where we are today. Right now, we're seeing Russian and Ukrainian forces fighting all across the country, and we're seeing actions that were forecasted in some of my other videos, basically forecasting the way that the cyberspace and information domain will be contested. Now, apart from ongoing denial of service attacks around Ukraine and denials to access to the internet and other kinds of outages, we've seen a number of other events happening in cyberspace as well. This includes what might be a denial of service attack on the Russian government, forcing many of the Russian government websites offline, although others are saying that the Russians are basically geofencing those sites and they're not actually suffering a denial of service attack, it's just a result of the geofencing. What is actually concerning, and what leads me to believe that cyberspace is what's really setting the pace for escalation over this conflict outside of Ukraine, is that we have basically a few sets of messages. One is from the US and NATO basically alerting private sector and public sector employees and organizations from the threat of a Russian cyber attack. They do note that they haven't noticed any attacks yet, but they basically give some basic steps outlining how to protect themselves and just being vigilant that really at any time this could happen. The reason that I say that this is concerning and that this is kind of climbing that escalation ladder is that under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, cyber attacks are considered an act of war. So it's not necessarily confirmed whether or not that is something that will be exercised in the case of a cyber attack. Certainly historically, both sides have gotten away with cyber attacks and obviously no declaration of war had been declared. But now when we're in an environment with active hostilities going on, that escalation ladder certainly gets to be a bit more concerning. And that's not to say that Russia is totally fine with climbing that escalation ladder too, with NATO at least. They may see that as a deterrent enough to not launch a cyber attack, but again, that's all speculation. There's also a report right now that Biden is considering launching cyber attacks on Russia, and this allegedly would target a number of logistical and critical infrastructure nodes that would be designed to degrade and disrupt Russia's ability to sustain its military in Ukraine. One note from that report is targeting Russia's rail system, which Russia seriously relies on with regards to sustainment and logistics. So it's definitely tailor-made for the Russian military. I do want to note here, though, that everything that I just said about Russia attacking the US and NATO, it works both ways. And so as we kind of look at that escalation ladder, cyberspace appears to be that pacing vector, and we're really going to have to keep our eyes on if anything happens here. It's not a guarantee that anything will happen, and it's not a guarantee that if something does happen, that escalation ladder gets climbed. There's plenty of very well exercised, known, and used deconfliction channels between both the US, NATO, and Russia, and both sides have an interest in deconfliction. So I definitely take any concerns that you see online that a cyber attack is definitely war with a very thin grain of salt. Now let's talk about the aforementioned WhisperGate malware attack, nicknamed HermeticWiper. Again, this is not the same as WhisperGate. As Juan Andreas Guerrero Sade says, and if you're watching this, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your name, but he basically wrote with Sentinel Labs some research that was being done on this malware as hostilities were increasing. He notes that unlike the WhisperGate strain, this really is not the same, and it's If you remember on the WhisperGate video, that malware was kind of had some elements of ransomware where it included a Bitcoin address and it kind of had some notes in it to kind of imply that it was like ransomware. Even though it wasn't encrypting anything, it was overriding anything. Yet this malware doesn't have that. It is strictly for destruction. But like WhisperGate, it does enumerate different storage volumes and overwrite everything. And most critically, it overwrites the master boot record and then it forces a restart of the system. And because the master boot record, which for those of you that don't know, that is what your computer uses to load its operating system. If it doesn't have access to that, it's not loading anything and your computer can't start. So it's effectively decommissioned. Whenever that malware detonates, it's effectively decommissioning machines. So this is that kind of malware that we were talking about earlier that's certainly concerning, that is designed for destruction. Interestingly, Juan notes that this malware uses a trusted and digitally signed certificate from Hermetica Digital Ltd. And that's kind of where he got the name for this from. But the reason that that's interesting is that that certificate was signed back in April of 2021, coincidentally the same month that we were seeing that initial surge of military equipment on the border of Ukraine. But that company appears to either be a shell company or repurposed defunct company. So it may very well be possible that is a way that the attackers, whether they be part of Russian intelligence or some other organization, to basically create trusted certificates to run on target machines and bypass AV. Now, I want to note that the time that that certificate was issued in April matches the same month that equipment initially surged forward, because although it may be coincidental, if you consider how much time is required for war planning, especially on the size and scope of, trying to create an invasion plan for Ukraine, it certainly would make sense that this is probably one of those things that's part of the war planning. But again, that being said, that's really speculation, so take that with the thinnest grain of salt. So that's that for HermeticWiper right now. But there's probably going to be a lot more research published in the near future. It doesn't appear that has spread outside of Ukraine for now, but it's definitely something to be concerned about. And regarding other cyber attacks, definitely stay tuned on this channel because we're going to be talking about it. But if you're just starting off and you want to catch up on a lot of the concepts and events that have led to this point, definitely check out this playlist because I've been pushing everything into there, including stuff like information warfare and hybrid warfare that might be important to you to be able to kind of understand what we're looking at both inside and outside of Ukraine. So with that, stay safe and I will see you all next time. Bye.